Welcome to Conversations with D&T, where we try to gain understanding to some of the more controversial passages in the Bible and how this understanding enhances our spiritual journeys. Hi, I am Diana.
And I am Tiffany.
And we are D&T.
This is a ministry of Langsburg United Methodist Church.
The purpose of our podcast is to help people become comfortable in asking questions about the content of the Bible, to demystify it, if you will. As we do this, we enhance our spiritual journeys.
So today we're going to talk about the creation story and the story of Adam and Eve. Diana, you have recently been reading and studying and preparing a really amazing message on this subject. So why don't you get us started?
So, thank you for the question. Let me go back a little bit about what I learned in Sunday school and see if it's the same thing that you learned in Sunday school.
Oh, yes, that's a great place to start.
So, what I learned in Sunday school was that, Eve was made from Adam's rib, right? Mm-hmm. And then Eve was tempted by the serpent and ate the fruit. And then, God came into the garden and God got mad at them, and then the punishment was now all the stuff that we go through in life is
we as women go through in life,
yes,
right? So the pain in childbirth and the menstrual cycle, all of this,
is all the punishment for us eating the fruit, and that we, we're the cause of the original sin. Mm-hmm. Women are,
yes,
but the Bible really doesn't say that.
No, it doesn't.
And it was just fascinating to me, and it's really a little bit different. And this comes to what we've been talking about in all of our other podcasts is you've got to unpack this stuff, and you've got to read it very, very closely.
Oh, yes.
So what if we do a couple things? So, let's talk a little bit about the first creation story. So that's in Genesis 1, right? Mm-hmm. So as you read that, it really goes through and it talks about how God creates everything, right? Mm-hmm. And it goes through the first 6 days of creation.
The first 6 days of creation, and each day it ends with it's really rhythmic and poetic. It ends with a statement, and it was so, and God saw that what he had made was good. Indeed, it was very good. It's just poetic. And then it goes on to say, and there was evening, and there was morning, whatever day, the first day, the second day, the third day. It's just poetic. It's poetry, really.
Yeah, it is. And the very interesting thing is that on the sixth day, humankind was made. Mm-hmm. And it was not man and woman. It was humankind. There was no separation, right? Yep. Mm-hmm. And there's no breakdown of exactly how it happened. Yep. It was just made, right? And then on the sixth day, it was rest.
Yes. Seventh day.
Sorry, misspoke. And so that was very interesting. But then when we get to the second creation story, which is in chapter 2, it gets a little bit more detailed, right?
Yes.
So, which is also a very beautiful story in and of itself, because it goes through talking even more in depth. So we understand how God created. So there's the creation of what we know to be the heaven and the earth. So there's the stars, there's the water, there's the the heavens, and the creation of the animals. And then in the end, as we get near the end, there's this creation of Adam, right? Adham, right?
With a little a.
With a little a. And in Hebrew, that means
humankind,
or man, woman, or earthy, ruddy. It has quite a few meanings depending upon how it is used in the sentence, right? When you go back and you look in the Hebrew text.
And when we translated it into English, we made this word a proper name.
Yes, we did.
And this is where we get the name Adam.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And then it goes on to say that it was made from Adhama, which has the Adaham, which means of earth or dust. So we know that God made Adam from the earth, right? Mm-hmm. And then breathed life into Adam.
This is why on Ash Wednesday, when we put the ashes on our forehead, we say, "From dust you were created, and to dust you shall return."
Correct. And yes, and so it's so beautiful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as you unpack that, it just starts to make a whole lot of sense. So now you go a little bit further, and then he takes Adam into basically the Garden of Eden. When you think about it, it doesn't really say that, but he talks about this domain that he has made, that God has made, right?
Yep.
And he allows Adam to name everything, right?
Yes, yep.
And then God realizes that none of the things that have been created so far are really a true partner.
Yep.
Okay? So he puts Adam to sleep, takes a rib, and makes Eve.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is the interesting part. From there, humankind over the centuries has said a woman is
Subservient to man, was created second, is second class, and oh man, you get into all kinds of trouble when you try and take this literally. When you look at the second creation story and look over the first.
correct. But we have to remember the first Genesis story. The first Genesis story says humankind was built in the image of God. Both
Yes.
were, correct?
Yes. All of humankind is created in the image of God.
Right. And that image of God is not what we see in the mirror every day, because what we see, that image of God, let me rephrase that, is what everybody sees in the mirror every day is a part of that image of God. Now, I don't know about you, but when I look in the mirror, I'm not seeing a man.
No. Nope.
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 When I get dressed in the morning, I'm not seeing the anatomy of a man.
Yep.
So I think that it's we have to remember that. And plus, we also, we can have another podcast, because I think it would be a really great discussion to talk about what does it mean to be created in the image of God. Mm-hmm. That's a whole nother podcast. That's a really cool discussion, I think, too. But here's something that's very interesting. You have turned me on to this book that's called Preaching the Women of the Old Testament by Lynn, is it Japinga?
I'm not sure.
Okay, but it's Japinga. Folks, this is a great book. I would suggest that you get it. It is phenomenal to read. But on page 8, let's see, about the third paragraph down, this is what it says. In the groundbreaking essay first published in 1972, Old Testament scholar Phyllis Tribble. And if you get a chance to read her work, folks, I suggest that you do that. That was something that I had an opportunity to study in seminary. Offered a detailed retelling of Genesis 2 through 3 story. She focused on the nuances of the Hebrew text itself without the influence of the story that said women were secondary and sinful.
Yes.
She saw that God created the human being, Adam, small a, out of dust, Adhamah, which was the Adhamah. Later, after deciding that the earth creature needed a partner, God put Adam to sleep, took a rib, and built another human being. Both were made in God's image. Mm-hmm. The woman was not fragile or weak or less intelligent than Adam. And this is the part that took my breath away. She was the culmination, catch that word, culmination of creation, not an afterthought. Let's talk about that. What does culmination mean?
It means the final act, the capstone, if you would say, the thing that sealed creation. To say God is finished, and this is perfect.
Exactly. The last thing God created, right?
Yes. Yep.
And it was the last beauty, the last created in His image.
Yes.
Okay, how in the world would God make that subservient? How could that be less than? anything.
Well, and something else that occurs to me is that word that, and I appreciated the way the word you were using as you were talking about this. God decided that Adam needed a partner. In other translations, it's often the word that is often used is helpmate, and we often take that to be subservient, but it's not. So I don't know if many of you listening are farmers, or if you've ever seen a team of animals pulling a cart or a plow, but they're yoke mates.
Exactly.
They're paired together to bear the load together. This is what it means for people who are married to one another to be partners, to be helpmates. It's to bear that load and the burden together. And that is truly the culmination of God's work, was the creation of humankind in a relational way, in which they could work together as a society and a community and a family.
I know. I absolutely agree. This is kind of a funny story. We had a team of Belgians that would drive our customers around our farm at Christmas time. And they were Duke and Prince. Prince was our lazy one. Okay? So whenever he could, he would just let Duke do most of the pulling. When Duke got fed up with this, he would turn around and he would bite Prince on the neck and tell him, you need to pick up some of this workload.
Yep.
And because he was the helpmate, and he got Prince's attention, and Prince would start doing his job. And sometimes he would do more than his job because Duke was tired and he would lay back a little bit. And they were both harnessed up next to each other. So in a way, they were like yoke mates. And it's the same thing when my husband and I are doing our farm. We both have our individual jobs, but if one of us wasn't doing our job, the farm wouldn't run as smoothly. So you are absolutely, and it's the same thing in a marriage.
Yep.
The best marriages, if you watch the couples who have the best marriages, it's because they are not competing with each other. They are not trying to do one up on each other. They are both doing something, they are constantly doing loving things for each other. I remember this story one time. It was between my parents. I thought my parents, they had their ups and downs, but they really had a very strong marriage. And I remember my dad saying to one of his students, he was a professor at Michigan State, and he said, one of his students, they wanted to go do something. He says, hey, I need to call home and check with my wife. And the student just said, hey, you're the man of the family. And he said, out of love for my wife, and everything that she has on her plate, I'm going to check with her. And that was just amazing. And that really spoke to me, because I happened to have been standing there, that this is how a husband should treat his wife. That was a lesson to me, that when I find my husband, that's what I should expect, right?
Yep.
And that is pretty phenomenal. I thought that was really a great...
And those models are really, really important for all people as they, move through life seeking, what they need for themselves in their partner.
Yes. Yes. But that, to me, when I think about getting back to that word culmination and about the capstone, so that put up a huge image in my mind. And so it was almost like a timeline. So all of a sudden, the timeline went backwards. So Eve is the last of God's creation in that creation story, right? I mean, God's creating all the time.
Yep.
But in that part of the creation story. So all of a sudden, you've got Eve. So if God is saying, and it was good at the end of every creation, so there was Eve, and then there's Adam, and Adam was created from earth, and earth was created in part of that creation story. And then you've got all this stuff that God has created, and in the beginning there was chaos, right? And all that got created by God. God doesn't create mistakes. God creates only good.
Yes.
And for anybody, and I don't care, male or female, to think that anybody is subservient to them is incorrect. It is not what God's creation is about. And to me, this even gets to the conversations of not male-female roles, but this gets to conversations about skin tone, about how you look, about in terms of like facial or your mental capacity or your physical capacities, any of those things. Or my gift is different than your gift, but that doesn't make your gift make you any better.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And so, and the thing is that we know in other parts of the Bible, God has given us all different gifts to be part of the body of Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes up the body.
Yeah. I mean, we can't all be hands or eyes or ears or feet. Otherwise, we would get nowhere.
Exactly. That's what makes up a body, right?
Yep.
I mean, if all I was a hand, how do I talk?
Yep.
Well, ASL, but maybe that was a bad example. But you get what I'm saying,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
So, anyways, so to me, this was such an eye opener, and we do such a disservice in Sunday school about, at least in my generation, about teaching this subservient role, and we have to do so much better, and we need to call out as Christians and as women, and our men need to do this too. Mm-hmm. This is not the role. And then this is where we get in trouble when we continue to do this.
Yeah.
Because this is not what the Bible says. And it's very clear it's not what the Bible says. Nowhere did it say that God created Eve to be Adam's servant.
No. And in fact, I would say, if we read the text, it actually almost implies the opposite. God instructs, after the fruit is eaten, God instructs Adam to till the earth. I mean, nobody's getting food unless Adam does his part.
Exactly.
Right? So, yeah, it's so funny. I think in Sunday school, we often oversimplify the stories, assuming that kids just can't quite grasp or get a hold of it, when in fact I think they see the disconnects and the pieces of the story that aren't working in a way that we just don't give them credit for. And we discussed beforehand that we wanted to read the scripture where Eve eats the fruit of the knowledge of the good of the tree, of the knowledge of good and evil. Yep. And I think it's important to actually read that text.
Yes.
So I'm going to go ahead and do that for us now. So we're reading Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. And this is from the New Revised Standard Version. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden'?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves."
There's a lot to unpack there, isn't there?
There is, yes.
So, a couple things that stand out to me. Nowhere in Genesis chapter 1 or 2 do we hear God or Adam tell Eve not to eat from the tree.
Yep.
So how does she know? Do we infer that one or the other tells her? But somehow she has knowledge of it, right?
So, somehow she knows she's not supposed to eat that fruit, but we like you said, we don't know. We don't hear God tell her. We don't hear Adam tell her. And, near as we can tell, the snake is asking her if God said this, but she, isn't, we don't know that she heard God say this.
Yeah, does she have first-hand knowledge or second-hand knowledge? Right.
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing that we get to unpack about this is because she was told not to do this and still does it, apparently free will existed in the Garden of Eden with humankind at that time.
Yes, yep. From the very moment of creation, yep.
Yep. And so that's even interesting to me. But here's the one that I find the most interesting. Her husband was there.
With her.
So he's hearing this conversation with the serpent.
Yeah, he's just standing off to the side right there, hearing everything, and just lets her do it.
And he's the one that we know for sure heard directly from God not to eat this fruit.
Exactly.
Okay, wait a minute. Whoa, bell's going off.
Right, where does the burden lie? If he's standing right there listening, and he's the one that was told.
Yeah, so what are you doing? Hanging your wife out to dry? Wait a minute. If my husband did that to me and knew I was going to get in trouble and I was going to die, and then secondly, there's no protest when she hands him the fruit to eat.
Right. And speaking of the hanging out to dry, when God finds them naked in the garden and they're ashamed, God asks, what's going on? And Adam says, the woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree and I ate it.
Throw me under the bus.
Throw her under the bus, yeah.
Are you serious? If my husband did that to me, I don't think the man be walking. Throw her under the bus, Adam. Go ahead.
Yep.
Seriously.
And the funny thing is that God then turns to Eve and asks her the same question. And she has so much more integrity in her statement. And she says, the serpent tricked me and I ate. She's telling the truth. It really was.
Not only telling the truth, but then she doesn't say, well, I know my husband told me not to, but, I did anyways. Or my husband didn't stop me. She doesn't say
any of that. It goes right to the serpent who tricked her.
Yeah, and she totally protects her husband. Mm-hmm. Because he was
standing right there.
Yeah, and she somehow should know that he knows not to do that.
Yes.
Right?
So what it really should say, right, is the serpent tricked me and my husband was standing there and he didn't do anything to stop me.
Right. And if it is true that she is supposed to be subservient to him as her boss, master, whatever you want to call him in that version, he should have been all over her.
Yep. Should have been looking out for her, making sure he did what she did what he was told, what he told her.
Particularly if he knew that they were going to die.
Yep.
Because that's what he said. That's what God said. You're going to die.
Yep.
But he took a bite of that lovely little fruit, Yep. And we also need to know that it being an apple is really somewhere down the line that got made up. Because the Bible only says it's some sort of fruit.
Yeah, we have no idea.
Yeah, it could have been a kumquat for all we know. But, that really blew my mind when I started unpacking that and I realized. So I went back to a number of translations in the Bible, and each translation does indicate, the ones that I looked up, that Adam was there. Mm-hmm. It's not that he wasn't, that he was just this, or that she walked over there and said, oh, here, honey, here's some, snack, go ahead and eat this, and tricked him into eating it. No, he was there for this whole scene, so it wasn't like he was doing this without knowledge. And she has, for centuries, been blamed for this sin.
Which is interesting, because if you continue through chapter 13, right after the conversation God has with Adam and Eve about why they did what they did.
You mean chapter 3 or 13?
Chapter 3. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, chapter 3.
I knew what you meant, but because
beginning
we're
around
podcast, yeah.
beginning around verse 13. So in verse 14, God curses the snake first.
Yes.
And then he goes on to curse the relationship between man and woman.
And what does that curse mean?
It means that there will be conflict, that we will have to work hard to maintain right relationship with one another.
Exactly. That's what it means. And we have to make sure that we understand that's why marriages have to be worked at. That's why friendships between men and women have to be worked at.
Yep.
That's why jealousy creeps up into situations and fights between married couples and people who are close. And you know what? It's any relationship. It's not just men and women, but even
all
friends,
relationships.
all
yeah.
relationships. Yeah. It's something that happens to humankind.
Mm-hmm. And then, after God curses the snake and the relationship between man and woman, then God takes one very short verse, which is the one that we all, that has been drilled into our heads since our childhood, Sunday school, is that, birth pains and childbearing. But then God goes on to do 3 verses of curses against the man.
It sort of gets lost, doesn't it?
Yeah, it just gets lost, yes. So it curses him to till the land, and that he's going to have to work for everything. And then the very end, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Like I said, the words we say on Ash Wednesday, these are the words that were spoken to Adam and Eve as they were cast out from the Garden of Eden. This is what it means that they will die. They no longer have life eternal on earth in the Garden of Eden. They will now experience trials, tribulations, struggles, and they will die.
So then, if we take this a little bit further and talk a little bit about this, and this is just kind of my theory in a way, it's sort of like, if we look at the Bible, like we've talked before, that this is a story of a people and a time. This is their way of explaining why women have menstruation.
Menstruation, yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what did I say? Oh, I didn't say it right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. And that why childbearing is painful.
Painful and dangerous and life-threatening.
And so how do they make that happen? So this is, why is that so? And so when you think about those kind of things, this story makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But we do forget about this part about man, who have been responsible for the agricultural end of, raising the food and stuff. Why is that so difficult for them? Mm-hmm. Well, when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And so when you go back and you tie that part into it, this all begins to make sense as to why this would be the culmination or the reason why the story has to go here.
Yes, yeah.
And so, to me, this all makes sense. What I think is that over the years, the centuries, the interpretation...
It's got lost in translation.
Exactly.
And I've found this to be the case in many of the passages of Scripture that I've preached on in my life and ministry. Actually sitting down and reading the text and asking the critical questions, what does this really say? What is this text actually saying? Makes a huge difference from, reciting the story from rote that we learned as children.
Yes.
There are nuances to every biblical story that we miss in the oral retelling. But that's why we have it written down. It's why we have it translated, and that's why we have many different translations, because they often capture the meaning differently, more accurately, or in a way that's easier for us to understand.
Right. And to me, the beauty of being able to unpack this the way that we did says to me a number of things. As we indicated earlier, humankind has had free will, was created with it.
Mm-hmm.
It explains creation culminated with Eve. But we have the 12 tribes, right? And went on. How is that going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
And this makes sense because Eve is the beginning, right? She's the mother.
Yep.
So to me, this all makes sense. And the fact that even though, and until we get to Cain and Abel, we never hear about sin, right?
Yes.
So even we call it
the story of original
sin,
yeah.
But we never hear about sin until Cain and Abel. Maybe that's the original sin, right?
Yep.
So, and I'm tongue-in-cheek with that, but it's sort of like, this is telling us that no matter how bad it is. So think about eating from that tree. That was the first command that we know of that was given to humankind by God.
Mm-hmm.
And it was broken.
Yep.
But God still is with us.
Yes.
Okay,
yep.
That story to me is life-giving. If you take the very first command that God gives you when you break it, and God is still with us,
yep.
How do you measure that love? How do you measure that being created in that image? I don't know.
It's immeasurable. God's love is unbounded.
To me, that tells me getting mad, holding a grudge, doing all this stuff. What are you thinking, Diana? This all means God never did that. Mm-hmm. And when humankind broke that first commandment, where do you think you come off?
Mm-hmm.
You know? Wow, that's enormous love that I just can't measure. You're right. It's immeasurable.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yes. One more thing that we should say about the story of Genesis is this was a creation myth. They wrote it down. The people of God wrote it down as an attempt to explain creation and God's role in creation. It was never intended to be taken literally, which is why we haven't taken it literally today. But we have looked at the literary context of the words of the story and done our best to interpret them in light of their intended meaning and purpose.
But, and I think this is really interesting. One time when I was working, we got into this discussion with a number of my colleagues. And we were talking about evolution and religion. And we were talking about, okay, let's talk about the creation story. And one of the people said, why can't it be both?
It is both.
And that's what I'm trying that's what I'm trying to talk about. Is when you think about that, when they talk about in the beginning,
yep.
It was kind of like there was this chaos. Well, when you think about what science says is the universe was created out of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
That's what God created, right? It was
yep.
out of chaos. And so in my mind, I understand exactly what you're saying because I even said that in terms of this was the way of explaining
mm-hmm.
Adam and Eve and everything and the reason for women's issues for the dangers of pregnancy and the periods and all that stuff. But it can be both. And that's the beauty of this. This is taking something that they had not had the science and trying to figure it out. So I totally get it. And to me, that's the beauty of it,
mm-hmm.
is that it's the faith part of it, right?
Yep.
And you're still able to pull beautiful things out of this God-inspired story.
Yes. So one of the things that I find fascinating, as I said, the creation story and evolution. Like I believe God created through evolution.
Oh, absolutely.
But as I look at the creation story, particularly the one in chapter 1 of Genesis, the first creatures that God created were the fish of the sea. And this is where we know evolution began in the waters.
So they had some idea.
That has to be God inspired. That, like, of all of the things, they could have started with the birds of the air. They could have started with the creatures of the land. But they started, when they composed Genesis 1, they began with the fish of the sea, which is where we know evolutionarily
that's where it came from.
That every living thing came from. That has to be God inspired for them thousands of years ago to have placed the beginning of the creation of creatures
exactly
in the waters.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and that's the God inspired part. So the thing is that when you get in these discussions with people who are agnostics or atheists, it's very important to have what we just discussed. This is the God inspired. This is incredible. What you just said. It's like, how would they know to have this part first and not this other part? It's got to be God inspired. At least my faith says that's what it is. It has to be. And yet, and it's okay to say, and it's okay to question, and it's okay to say, we know that these are things that are not absolutes. They're not science oriented. They are what we would call myths. Not in terms of the myths like, as we think of them today, but these are not things that can be proved by science, which is what our brains want to do and our society wants to do today. So this has been a wonderful wonderful conversation. I really hope that this has inspired people in terms of how you need to take the Bible and you read carefully, and that you use other resources to help you understand things, and that it is okay. It is truly okay to question.
Oh, yes. Always ask questions.
Yeah. And that the Bible, God does not intend the Bible to be the end all and me. What's the phrase? The be all end all.
Yep.
It is a tool in our faith journey that we use. And there are so many other resources that are available. And
if you are trying to ask questions and you don't know where to begin, contact Diana or I, and we would both be delighted to help you find the resources.
Totally. And we are also more than open to have conversations. We expect people not to necessarily agree with our conversations. And if you want to have more in-depth conversations, we're happy to do that as well. We are also happy to take on subject matters that you would like to talk about. So please just let us know. Drop us a note. Send us even pick up the phone and give us a call. We're happy to do that. We enjoy these conversations. We sometimes surprise ourselves in the middle of them. One of the things that we're thinking about is to start filming our podcast, because you miss a lot of our expressions as we're having these conversations of how much we sometimes we're discovering things during them. So again, we thank you for joining us today. We hope that you have a good day and a good week, and God bless.